Okay, it looks like we're reaching critical mass territory here, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started if that's okay. Really looking forward to this conversation today, and I really appreciate all those who are tuning in for this because I think it's an incredibly important conversation. Before I get too much into it, I just want to thank the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC, for sponsoring this event. I think it's an incredibly, again, important conversation. And it's one that often happens, I think, siloed, sort of context by context. And so it's an incredible privilege to be here with other professionals who work in very difficult circumstances and who have a lot of experience to share on these issues. So a big thank you to NIAC, to our panelists, and to everybody tuning in today. We're really looking forward to a great conversation. Just quickly, I'll introduce myself. I'm your host, your moderator today. I'm Dan Jasper with the American Friends Service Committee. My role there is the Asia Public Education and Advocacy Coordinator. And most of my work is centered on US-North Korea as well as US-China relations. And in recent years, my work has broadened out a little bit to include sanctions as well. And we've worked with a number of organizations to help sort of create spaces for organizations to start pooling their expertise and bringing folks together. And NIAC has been a huge, huge help on that. I'll be guiding us through this conversation. Just quickly, it's worth mentioning that the topic of our conversation today is sanctioning civilians, the human cost of US economic warfare. So central to this discussion is the issue of US policies on sanctions and economic cohesion on a global scale, and its impact on civilian populations in targeted countries. So we're going to hopefully make this a little bit more conversational than normal panels. It's important, I think, just because we're dealing with so many contexts, for folks to give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening in each context. So I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers, read through their bios so you know who we have on the horn here. And then we're going to turn to them to just give us a brief 3-minute introduction, sort of the current situation and the relationship with the United States, how sanctions fit into their work, and then how their work intersects with all of this as well. So just quickly, I'll start with Arash Azizzada, who's a writer and photographer and community organizer based in Los Angeles, California. A child of Afghan refugees, Arash is deeply committed to dismantling white supremacy and building equitable communities. Last year, he co-founded Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, an Afghan American community and advocacy organization aiming to bring transformative change to Afghans in the United States and beyond. He has led evacuation and rapid response coordination efforts in the wake of America's military withdrawal from Afghanistan. And Arash has written for the New York Times, Newsweek, and has been featured on Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, NPR, and Vice News. Welcome, Arash. We're really pleased to have you with us. We also have Dr. Aisha Jumaan. Dr. Jumaan is the president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, has over 30 years of experience in public health, and is currently working as an independent consultant coordinating health-related projects in Yemen. She was with the US Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention from 1995 to 2008, and served as an assistant professor at the Rollins School of Public Health Epidemiology Department at Emory University. Aisha also worked in her native home, Yemen, with UNFPA and UNDP, participated in health-related program development, evaluation, and training activities for Peace Corps, was an assistant professor on the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Sana University, and consulted on research projects for various ministries, USAID, Save the Children, and the Dutch Embassy. She has a PhD in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her master's in public health from Emory University. She did ask me to shorten her bio, but I wanted to read the whole thing because I think it's quite impressive. And I think it's all relevant to our conversation today. So welcome, Dr. Jumaan. We also have Dr. Francisco Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is a Venezuelan economist and currently a director and founder of Oil for Venezuela, a nonprofit organization focused on finding solution to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. He received an MA and PhD in economics from Harvard. Dr. Rodriguez has taught economics and Latin American studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, the Instituto, excuse my Spanish here, de Estudios Superiores de Administración, and Wesleyan University. He has held prominent positions in the public and private sector and international organizations, including head of the Economic and Financial Advisory of the Venezuelan National Assembly from 2000 to 2004. He's the head of was the head of the research team at the United Nations Human Development Report Office from 2008 to 2011. He is currently the International Affairs Fellow in International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Rodriguez is a frequent contributor to several publications such as Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, New York Times, and Foreign Policy, among others. He has published more than 50 research papers in academic outlets, including the American Journal and the Journal of Economic Growth. So we're very pleased to have you, Dr. Rodriguez. And last but not least, we have NIAC's own research director, Dr. Assal Rad. Assal earned a PhD in history from the University of California, Irvine in 2018. Her PhD research focused on modern Iran, and she has had a forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press titled The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more, and she has appeared as a commentator on the BBC World, BBC Persian, Al Jazeera, and NPR. So welcome, Dr. Rad. We have an incredible lineup, as you just witnessed here. So I'm really excited to jump into the conversation. And again, I want to start by just sort of setting the context. And if I could, again, just ask our panelists to focus on three things: the current situation in the country, the current country's relationship with the United States, how sanctions fit in, and how your work intersects with all these things. If we can start with Arash Azizzada, and you could tell us a little bit about what's happening in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to NIAC for hosting all of us and giving us the spaces to talk about something that is in Afghanistan specifically is significantly impacting 38 million people. And to start off this conversation, I think we have to acknowledge that the United States has been party to conflict, been involved either in a proxy war or directly been involved in conflict in Afghanistan for the past 42 years. And to give context, I'm 34 years old. This conflict has been roughly 10 years older than myself. And so this has been going on for multiple generations. And what we have seen specifically in the past 20 years is that the United States has made Afghanistan and the nation state that it attempted to build and the institutions that it attempted to build in Afghanistan heavily dependent on foreign aid, roughly 75% of the GDP. And basically, you know, I went to visit Afghanistan in 2019. There's not many places you can go, not many ministries you can see. Pretty much most institutions or projects are funded by USAID, the United States government, the European Union, Japan, or any of these other countries. And so we had a nation state that was heavily not just influenced but coerced by Western donors, and the primary donor being obviously the United States. And so what we saw in the wake of the US military withdrawal, which happened essentially in August of 2021, when the Taliban took control of the entire country, is that the United States did essentially three things. The first one was an immediate end to all the foreign aid that was being poured into the country. That was to the tune of at least $8.5 million, if not more, every year. And so that faucet got turned off almost overnight. The second item to that is being the immediate freezing of sovereign Afghan assets. That's something that's been in the news, and the Biden administration has made some controversial decisions. That is money that belongs to the Afghan people, that is usually used by the central bank of most sovereign nations to inject liquidity and maintain the basic functions of an economy. That money sits now frozen at the New York Federal Reserve and some European banks as well. And then the third item is what we're discussing today, which is the U.S. sanctions. And American sanctions on Afghanistan have been placed on Afghanistan for a very long time. These are sanctions that are either placed on the Taliban and the Haqqani network. Well, the Haqqani network and the Taliban control the entirety of the country now, which has meant a lot of complications when you're thinking when in July, the United States was paying, in July of 2021, the United States was paying for the salaries of, for example, national soldiers of the Afghan army. And then now you have thousands of soldiers who are being unpaid, who don't have any jobs anymore. And so that now takes us to the situation currently, which is that 22 million people are deeply food insecure. Most pockets in the country are either 1 or 2 steps away from famine. 1 million Afghan children are on the verge of death. And we have seen a report that came out of roughly 2 months ago. So that was in March of this year, that at least 13,000 Afghan children had already died from either malnutrition or starvation or negligence. And so what we are seeing is obviously that the Taliban is deeply responsible for this incompetence, this mess, the fact that Afghans are starving. But the main culprit here is the United States, which has the most autonomy, the most agency over that country still. And so the Biden administration has claimed that it has ended this war. But, I think before August, we were thinking and brainstorming as a community and advocacy organization, how do we end the war, and how do we make Afghans have agency? How do we put Afghans in control of their own faith and their own sovereign borders? And now we are trying to figure out how to end America's economic strangulation of Afghanistan. And obviously that work kind of brings this group together, because what the United States is doing to Afghanistan is happening in other places, whether that's in Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, or elsewhere across the country. So I'll leave it at that. There's much more to discuss in terms of how America's enabling this economic strangulation towards the Afghan people.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking forward to digging into that. I think, some of the themes that you brought up are likely to be recurring throughout our conversations, including, the longevity of these conflicts and the idea of unended war. I think we'll see that quite a bit. Thank you, Arash. Now I quickly want to turn to Dr. Jumaan, if you could give us your context.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Well, I want to start by, and Arash, everything you mentioned is very familiar in Yemen as well. Yemen imports about 90% of its needs, whether it's medicine, fuel, or food. Yemen has been under US sanctions in addition to US-enabled blockade by the Saudi-led coalition since 2015. So with that, especially on the port of Data. With that, those two things have done are, one is the destruction of the economy in Yemen. 2 is push millions of people into poverty. And 3 is we have mass starvation, with 16.2 million people in Yemen are food insecure today. ICRC just published today that there are 20 million people in Yemen who are in need of humanitarian assistance. There are 5 million women and children in Yemen today who are acutely malnourished. Of course, the psychological and development impact of the starvation are going to be something that Yemen will have to deal with for many generations to come. Of course, and this is also going to be true in many countries, transfers of funds to Yemen is restricted. We only have one bank that is intermediary, so we can send money to Yemen. People who want to send money to Yemen, individuals, are not allowed to send more than $2,000 a month. For an organization like ours, because we are, I started Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation in response to the mass starvation of the Yemeni people. It's very challenging for us to send money to Yemen. And now we are able to send it through one bank in Germany. We lose 4% of the money we send because it's in euro. There are ships that go to Data that are delayed after they get the UN inspection. And some of them just give up and leave because they are taken to a port in Saudi Arabia. They stay there, don't know how long. Sometimes they will stay there for a year. And after being there for a certain period of time, some ships just give in and leave without discharging in Yemen. Shipping companies refuse to go to Yemen right now. There are very few that go, and it's extremely expensive. And those who do stay and eventually dock in Yemen, Yemenis, have to pay the extra charge of the delays. I want to share something from the UN inspection mechanism. Here it shows the number of ships, of fuel ships that went into Yemen in 2021. And you can see it's 10% of what the fuel Yemen needs in fuel. That's in 2021. I also want to show this slide. It shows the number of containers. This is in 2016, which is a year after the war. There were about 40,000 containers that got into Yemen in 2016. In 2021, 1,600 were allowed to get into Yemen. That's about 4% of the containers that need to get into Yemen. So you can see with all of that, that the situation in Yemen is extremely dire. I also support Arash is that everybody thinks that humanitarian assistance and UN agencies and the humanitarian community can support a population of 13 million people. They cannot, because we know from this year, for example, the donations to Yemen are 1/3 of what Yemen needs to get the work done in terms of humanitarian assistance. The other thing also, which is Arash touched on, is the funds go to UN agencies and humanitarian organizations. So that basically means that the infrastructure, the national infrastructure, is deemed non-workable. They just destroy it basically. The Yemeni population, especially civil servants, they have not been paid salaries since 2016 when the National Bank was moved out of Sana'a. So there are just a lot of that's going on. I just want to touch on one more thing. There is a truce in Yemen right now that was started on April 2nd for 2 months. And guess what? In the negotiation for the truce, the Saudi said they will allow 18 ships of fuel to get into Yemen. And they will also allow twice a week flights from Sana'a airport that's been shut by the Saudis since 2016. They will allow 2 flights a week. 6 weeks into the truce, we have only 2 more weeks, only 2 flights were allowed to get out of Sana'a. So that's just basically what the Yemeni people are experiencing. I call them hostages. The Yemeni people are held hostages to the US and Saudi-led coalition. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much for those points. I mean, really, really important stuff here. And a lot of it sounds very familiar to the North Korea context. And actually some of the data looks very, very similar, unfortunately. And I'll look forward to asking you a little bit more about this dynamic between aid groups getting more money and the infrastructure being neglected. And that's really sort of where security comes from. Thank you for that. I want to turn to Dr. Rodriguez for Venezuela context.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks, Daniel, for that introduction. Thanks to NIAC for organizing this talk. Venezuela has suffered the largest economic collapse in modern Latin American history. And it's also one of the largest collapses in world economic history. Its per capita income has shrunk by 72% since 2012, which is the equivalent of nearly 4 Great Depressions. Poverty has risen to 94%, 1/4 of the population is undernourished, and the country has suffered the 3rd longest hyperinflation documented in world history. Over the past 4 years, together with the team that I direct at the Oil for Venezuela Foundation, we produced research investigating to what extent have sanctions contributed to this crisis. The answer is that economic sanctions have made a significant contribution, particularly through their impact on the country's oil industry. And this is a result of the fact that sanctions were primarily aimed at hurting Venezuela's oil industry. This is well documented now in memoirs written, for example, by former National Security Advisor John Bolton, by former Defense Secretary Esper, who have, among other things, recounted that sanctions were among the most moderate options adopted by the Trump administration, which actually discussed bombing Venezuelan oil refineries as part of their attempt to bring down the government of Nicolas Maduro. Now, I want to share a number of slides from our research very quickly to give you an idea of the magnitudes that we're talking about here. So this is Venezuela's per capita output from 1950 to 2020. And here, what you can see is that the decline that we are seeing over the course of the past 8 years is unlike anything that we had seen previously in Venezuelan economic history, even though the country had had poor growth performance in prior periods. It's not only that, it is actually, as I already mentioned, one of the worst collapses experienced by any country in peacetime. It's actually the second largest collapse since 1950 experienced by a country in peacetime, and the sixth largest worldwide. And when we start trying to understand what is it that drives this collapse, what we find behind it is the collapse of the country's oil revenues. So oil accounted for 96% of the country's exports prior to the crisis. And oil revenues, which were approximately $100 billion a year in 2012, have fallen to less than $10 billion a year in 2020-21. Now, you may hear among some of the discussion on Venezuela, some people claim that the country's crisis began before sanctions, and that therefore sanctions are not the cause of the crisis. And this involves very fallacious and misleading reasoning, among other things, because economic and social phenomena are multi-causal. So the crisis may have been driven by poor economic policies, by mismanagement, by corruption, and sanctions have also made a contribution. There's no contradiction between saying that there are several factors that have an impact on a country's crisis. But aside from that, because the crisis and the collapse in GDP that began in around 2013-14 had to do with declining oil prices, and that's what you see in this slide. Between 2012 and 2016, oil prices fell from about $100 a barrel to around $30 a barrel. And that drove a significant decline in oil exports, which impacted the economy, as any economy that loses 2/3 of its export revenue in the space of 3 years is going to be severely impacted. But as oil prices began to recover in 2017, you do not see a recovery in oil revenues. Why? Because oil production was declining. So in our research, we've looked carefully at the determinants of Venezuela's oil production. This is how oil production performed from 2008 on. So we see from 2008 to 2015, a period of stability in oil production. Oil production begins declining in 2016, early 2016. Now, this actually happened in a lot of countries because this is the period during which oil prices were also falling. So many oil producers would cut production, given that oil was being sold for less than 70% the price that it was able to receive just 1 year earlier. However, as oil prices began to stabilize and recover, Venezuela was hit by the first financial sanctions on the oil industry, which barred it from obtaining new financing, which barred it from obtaining dividends from its offshore activities, and which barred it from restructuring its debt. And there, which is when oil production started to stabilize in other countries, we see oil production, the drop in oil production accelerate in Venezuela. Then we have the 2019 oil sanctions, which barred any type of oil trade between Venezuela and the US. We see another significant impact there. And we see the 2020 secondary sanctions on foreign oil partners, which had also a significant effect. There's more detailed research, some of it which looks at firms producing in the Venezuelan oil industry in different sectors, and particularly those firms that had access to finance prior to the 2017 sanctions, and those that did not have access, and finds a significant difference between them. Again, consistent with evidence of the impact of sanctions. Now, something that I want to point out, and a lot of what we do at Oil for Venezuela is think through what should be the design of an institutional framework that would serve as an alternative to the current situation. Of course, you could think, well, maybe they should just lift all sanctions, and that that in many cases would be an adequate solution. In the case of Venezuela, because the government recognized by the US is the government headed by former legislator Juan Guaido, the Maduro government would not have access to any funds in the US, nor would it be able to sell oil because the proceeds from that oil would belong to the state, the board of the state, or would be managed by the board of a state-owned oil company that has been appointed by Juan Guaido. So therefore, what we have focused is on the signing proposals for negotiated agreements between the parts to the political conflict that can be brought forward, for example, in the context of the current ongoing talks between these sides in Mexico, so that some type of co-governance agreement over the oil revenues with the adequate international supervision to ensure that they go to address the country's humanitarian crisis can be implemented, and the country, and particularly the country's most vulnerable population, can be protected from the collateral effect of the country's political conflict.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Dr. Rodriguez. I think some of that data is really important to see and is really quite striking. And I look forward to having some further conversations about the current diplomacy happening around Venezuela right now. I want to turn to Dr. Rad for some context in Iran.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And I think that this conversation, I'll be brief about my context because I want to get us into the conversation that we have together. But I think what's interesting in listening to this is that you see patterns, right? The essential thing that we're discussing today is that the humanitarian impact of US economic and sanctions policies, the fact that they hurt ordinary civilians is not an exception. It's actually the rule, right? This is why we're seeing in so many different contexts that this is repeatedly what's happening. Now, in the context of Iran, the US and Iran have been adversaries or have had an adversarial relationship for decades. That adversarial relationship experienced a breakthrough, a diplomatic breakthrough in 2015 when the US, the P5+1 and Iran entered into the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal, in which Iran promised to allow unprecedented international inspections of its nuclear program in exchange for economic relief of sanctions. Now, for those of us who know, in 2018, the Trump administration withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions and actually expanded sanctions on Iran, making it at the time the most sanctioned country in the world. In fact, Iran was the most sanctioned country in the world up until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. Iran is number 2. What those sanctions have done in terms of their impact on the Iranian civilian population, there's no question to it. And there's a tendency for advocates of sanctions to say things like, well, humanitarian goods are exempt. They absolutely are on paper. On paper, they are exempt. And so we have a difference between de facto and de jure. What happens in actuality, what happens on the ground is that those essential goods, the flow of those goods into the country are impeded. Do not take my word for it. Take the word of our president, Joe Biden, who said this himself in a statement in April of 2020, specifically talking about Iran. While he acknowledged the humanitarian exemptions, he also acknowledged the fact that the reality on the ground, and this was, during the beginning of the pandemic, that the reality on the ground was that US sanctions were impeding the flow of essential goods. To understand the sort of the way that US policy works vis-a-vis sanctions, if you look at the case of Iran, Iran was a country that early on was one of the first countries that was very hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And when the United Nations, when human rights organizations, when WHO, when all of these international entities were calling for an easing of sanctions in light of the pandemic, not only for the humanitarian purposes of the civilians in that particular targeted country, but also because it required a global reaction. It required us to combat it globally, and therefore we needed to cooperate globally. The US actually doubled down and expanded sanctions on Iran. This was under the Trump administration. The Biden administration, despite entering into negotiations with Iran to revive the nuclear deal, has essentially maintained that policy, has maintained those sanctions in an ongoing pandemic. And now with the war in Ukraine, as we're experiencing in the US, imagine right now in the United States. I mean, gas prices are exorbitantly high. We're experiencing inflation. ordinary working class Americans are suffering. Now imagine all of the impacts that are happening globally, but you are one of these countries that we are talking about, and the most powerful economy in the world on top of everything else is sanctioning you. So now imagine how much that exacerbates those problems that already exist. There are statistics that say millions of middle-class Iranians have been forced into poverty in recent years. They've experienced hyperinflation that have caused, the most vulnerable people in that society to be affected, while the supposed targets of these sanctions remain relatively unscathed. It is the most vulnerable, the working class, the poor, women-led households, disabled people. All of these groups are the ones who are most impacted by sanctions. And so I will leave it at that as we continue to have our discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rod. And I think those are some incredibly important points. And I think you're pulling out a lot of things that are commonalities between these circumstances. And before we get into the sort of conversation portion of this, I want to give a quick overview of the context in North Korea. Quickly, I think many have probably heard the latest news reports that there has been an outbreak of COVID in the country. This is really important, I think. And again, it's important to have context here, right? And I just want to quickly remind our viewers that the United States and North Korea are in a state of war and have been for over 70 years. You'll remember that the Korean War ended in 1953, or the active fighting came to an end with a ceasefire, but there was never a peace treaty. And so when we start to talk about things like the missile tests happening right now, which is often put in relationship to humanitarian aid, it's important to keep that context in mind, because I think a lot of Americans look at that and are very confused as to why there are missile tests at this point. And that is largely because we have been frozen in a state of war for over 70 years. Going back to the COVID context, this is an incredibly vulnerable population. I think North Korea has, their healthcare infrastructure has been ranked 193 out of 195. Shortly after the outbreak in Wuhan, North Korea closed its borders to travel and to cargo. Some cargo has been allowed into the country, but last I looked, I think it's reached maybe about 38% to pre-COVID levels. So supplies are running low, and by the government's own admission, there are significant food security problems as well. So we have a population that is food insecure, supplies are running low, and is now dealing with an outbreak of COVID. This is incredibly important. In the case that I actually just made to U.S. government officials right before this call was that, we have to treat this as a global security issue. We have to separate the government actions from ordinary individuals. Not only is that the morally right thing to do, but it's also the strategically right thing to do, right? Because we have to see this as a national security issue as well. Because if, COVID runs rampant in North Korea, there's plenty of chances for mutations in different variants. Quickly, I just want to give a quick context. And I think I've heard from many of our panelists that 2017, 2016 time period is very critical for a lot of these places. And especially with North Korea, that was the case. It's worth noting that, humanitarian operations have been there since about 1980. And in 2017, we were basically, slowly closed down. And it got to the point where it was very difficult to send aid. UN resolutions went so far as to mention things like paper clips and spoons. And so you had situations where there was cargo building up at ports, and some of it even had the correct paperwork, but because of miscommunication and customs officials on the ground not quite understanding the regulations, things were being held up. And so you had instances where patients were in surgery without anesthesia, people were going without malnutrition programs, all because of basic paperwork. Now, while some of that has been sorted out, it's worth noting that, that was only months before the pandemic hit. And we found ourselves in a moment where the existing international health cooperation that existed in North Korea was basically damaged and didn't have time to rebuild itself prior to the pandemic. And I really personally think that may play a role in terms of them accepting international aid. So we are in a precarious situation, and I think that in terms of the United States and their position on this, they really need to start altering regulations, because humanitarian organizations are going to need to respond quickly to this situation. So I'll stop there with the North Korea context, and I want to enter sort of the more conversational parts of our panel today. And we have a number of questions that we can go through, and I think we're probably going a little bit further in time than I was hoping. But I think I want to pick up on this point that Assal made around the impact on humans and who really bears the cost of sanctions. I want to turn to Arash, if that's okay, and I want to ask about who is bearing the costs and burden in Afghanistan right now, because I've heard some very troubling reports of what people are needing to do right now inside the country in order to sort of stay afloat.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of different stories I can share that shows the level of deprivation that's happening in Afghanistan. But just looking back at the history of sanctions that's been placed specifically on the Taliban and the Haqqani government, which is essentially the de facto authorities in Afghanistan, those sanctions were in place, and from the day that those sanctions were in place, the Taliban had very little control of the country, and now we see that it's actually has more authority, it has more responsibility, and has more recognition throughout the diplomatic recognition throughout the world than ever before. So that is the level of impact sanctions has had specifically on the Taliban. Now, who's bearing the real cost of that? It's the Afghan people, and I think it's good to remember that when the Taliban was in charge during the 90s, which was a period roughly between 1996 until 2001, until the United States intervention, Afghanistan was by far the poorest country in the world. And the number one effect of Western intervention in Afghanistan was specifically that child mortality rates actually dropped. They dropped all by just such a large amount. And now we're seeing kind of that reversal again. The Taliban is again in power. The United States is exerting its economic influence over the country, and the United Nations, for example, cited some statistics that said 98% of the Afghan population will have plunged into extreme poverty. So there were some minor success stories in the past 20 years, but what the economic strangulation of Afghanistan is ensuring is that there's a huge brain drain, that technocrats have left the country, and the fact that the economy that even was built up, and we can sit here and have a very long conversation about what the United States had built in those 20 years. It was very much dependent on Western foreign aid, an economy that was not really sovereign or independent, but even that economy is like now slowly disappearing. So now we have a country where there is no future prospect for jobs. There is no middle class anymore, and what we are seeing, the common stories that we are seeing now every day and every week, is that people are selling organs. People are selling their liver or their kidneys, able to survive. And so I always tell the story of messages that I got in beginning of August. Get me out of here. How can I get on one of these evacuation planes? How can I get on a charter plane? How can I leave the country? Now the message is the same. I want to get out of here because not only is the Taliban in power, but me and my family are essentially starving to death. And to try to circumvent that, the United States government has failed in many different ways and has, put this this deep level of harm on the Afghan people. But it really has placed the burden on the Afghan diaspora, the Afghan American community organizations, everyday Afghan Americans to raise money to make a small dent in the level of deprivation and starvation that is happening throughout Afghanistan.
Yeah, thank you for that, Arash. It's so troubling to hear. Before I move us on to another part of the conversation, I want to open this up because the impacts on the ground are very startling. And I know that we could all probably speak to this at length. And I'm curious if any other panelists want to jump in on this point.
I do. I think one of the issues with sanctions is they're silent killers. People die in their homes. Nobody's counting those deaths. So the US and the international community are oblivion and I don't think the US is oblivious, the US administration, they know what's happening. But first is there's no risk to the US. There is no opposition. If there's a war, people get out to the streets and they riot. But when you have sanctions and people are dying in their homes and nobody's counting them, you can keep them for a long time and nobody is going to oppose you. So I think it's extremely important for people to understand the impact of these sanctions. We wrote a paper in 2017 about the impact on the Yemeni population. Yemen has lost by 2017, which is 2 years after the war and the blockade in Yemen, has lost 10 years of advancement in the health indicators in Yemen. So infant mortality was going up, maternal mortality was going up, everything, measles outbreaks, COVID outbreaks, the largest cholera outbreak in the world, everything. I mean, even diphtheria. Yemen had not had diphtheria since 1980. And now we have, probably the longest diphtheria outbreak. It's been going on for almost 4 or 5 years now. So, and nobody's counting those deaths as a result of what I consider sanction as an aggression on the civilian population. And so it's very important to educate the public about the impact of the sanctions on the civilians and what for unattainable goals that are put on the elite of these countries. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, and such incredible, important points there. And one of them being that, there isn't really official government impact assessments on a lot of these regulations. And so you're hearing a lot of panelists describe that it's usually civil society that is undertaking these impact assessments. And so that's quite disturbing that the US government doesn't know, or at least publicly admit, what the consequences of these policies are. I want to quickly turn to Dr. Rad and ask, so here we are, we're confronted with the impacts on the ground and that it is the, ordinary people bearing the costs. Why do we hear this narrative that sanctions are targeted now and that there are humanitarian exemptions? And it seems to sort of excuse and circumvent this idea that there is impact on the ground.
Oh, well, echoing on what Aisha said, look, why do we hear that? Because they have to say that. That's the reality. Let's just put it bluntly. It's a PR tactic, right? If you say, yes, we know we're killing a bunch of civilians, it doesn't sound as good when you use this tactic. The reality of it is and for me, the point of this conversation is to bring this out in terms of a conversation. We hear the concept of ending endless war. This is now ubiquitous in US political discourse, right? Whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, by the way, right? President Trump was outspoken against the disasters of wars in Iraq and wars in the Middle East. He wanted to end endless wars. President Biden ran on a platform saying he wants to end endless war. In fact, that was the reason for withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. But Afghanistan is actually a perfect example. So we talk about ending endless war by withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. And yet in the wake of, and I'm not saying that troops should not have been withdrawn, but the economic policies that we've implemented potentially can cause more death than a 20-year war. What does it mean to end endless war? Yes, part of it from an American point of view is to not use our resources in a particular way. And Aisha brought this point up. She says, it doesn't carry a cost. Now that's true to a certain extent. It's not totally true, right? And we're seeing that right now with the sanctions on Russia. We're seeing what happens when you have a global economy and when you try to sanction everyone to death and pretend like it's not going to affect the United States in any way. Why is the Biden administration using a phrase like Putin's price hike, right? When we sanction countries, just consider this sort of paradox. When we sanction countries and those countries suffer, the civilians in those countries suffer, the US point of view is never, at least the US governmental official point of view is never, it is our sanctions that are causing civilian deaths and suffering. It is the mismanagement and corruption of those very states. But when American working class are suffering under price hikes and inflation, somehow that's still someone else's fault. it's not the U.S. government's fault. It's someone else's fault. So why the government, why U.S. officials frame things the way they do is why would they do it in any other situation? It's to never take responsibility or blame for any consequences that occur, whether it's within our own domestic policies or whether it's policies abroad. But the reality of it is a conversation about ending endless war has to involve economic warfare, economic policies. The entire point, the moral point, at least, there's that, right? There's the sort of pragmatic logistic point as an American as to why you can't just use this policy forever and think it's never going to have any kind of effect on yourself. But there's also the moral argument, right? The moral argument of why sanctions were supposed to be used to begin with was that, an international community was created in the wake of world wars to say that we should avert the scourge of war. I think that in the preamble of the United Nations, it's like the first sentence. That's the entire concept. What can we do so that nation states do not fight each other? Because what happens? What was the purpose behind that? The casualties, the civilian cost, the human cost of those conflicts, that still exists under economic policies that starve people. It's just that it's not happening, and it's certainly not being covered in US media to the same extent as the consequences of direct warfare or bombs are. But that's why I bring up the example of Afghanistan. If more Afghans will possibly die in the wake of a war, what does that mean for that policy?
Yeah, extremely well said there. And I think, North Korea certainly fits under that rubric as well in terms of endless war, right, being carried on by economic coercion. And I think it's also worth pointing out that, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, that really gives our Congress the authority to grant the president authorities, as far as I understand it, in terms of emergencies. And this has been used in some cases for over 50 years to sanction a country. Now, it's really hard to make the case that an emergency can last 50 years. And so there are some real problematic sort of underlying legality and legal frameworks, I'll say. I quickly turning to Dr. Rodriguez, I wanted to ask, and I hope that you're okay answering this, but here, in terms of the people on the ground in sanctioned countries, who are they placing blame on? Because oftentimes we hear the narrative from US policymakers that, the country only has their leaders to blame for these economic impacts. But where do the people in these countries, such as Venezuela, where do they place blame? And how do they react to this? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Okay. No, I think it's a very interesting question because the first point that I'd like to highlight is that I think people are capable of much more complex reasoning sometimes than many US policymakers think them capable of. One of the problems when one discusses the impact of sanctions is that what's a typical response that one will get from the US administration is, no, it's not the fault of sanctions. It's the fault of Maduro. Maduro is the one who's to blame, and he's the only one to blame. And I, as an economist, when I see a high-ranking U.S. official answering this question, I kind of ask myself, well, did this person actually take a course in multivariate statistics? Do they understand that social phenomena have multiple causes, and that an economic crisis can be caused by the mistaken policies or the mismanagement or the corruption of a regime, and at the same time be impacted by sanctions? Well, it turns out that when you ask Venezuelans, they understand it perfectly well. They blame Maduro and they blame sanctions. If you ask them, who do you think is the person who's primarily responsible for the country's economic conditions, they'll say Maduro. But if you ask them, have sanctions negatively impacted the economy and have sanctions made your life worse, they'll definitely. And something that I want to point out about these surveys is that these are actually the same surveys. So you have surveys in which 75% of Venezuelans reject sanctions and only 10% support them. And these are actually the same surveys where 80% of Venezuelans disapprove of Maduro. So it's not that people are afraid to voice their opinion. At least when an independent survey taker comes up to them and asks them, they'll say, oh no, Maduro's a terrible president. This government's extremely corrupt. People will say all of these things to survey takers. And at the same time, they'll tell them that they're against the sanctions, that sanctions have hurt Venezuela, that they've hurt them personally. And by the way, that also means that the disapproval of the US government in Venezuela is just as high, if not higher than that of Maduro. And the ones who are in worse shape, believe it or not, are the Venezuelan opposition. So most recent surveys put Maduro at around 20% approval ratings, which is pretty low, but they put most opposition leaders like Juan Guaido at around 10% approval ratings. And one of the main reasons is that Venezuelans blame them for seeking sanctions and for contributing to exacerbating the country's crisis. Or in other words, if you're trying to convince voters that you are an alternative to the regime, the worst thing that you can do is support policies that exacerbate their suffering. I also wanted to speak a little bit to some of these legal questions that you raised, which I think are really interesting, because nowadays, in current war crimes legislation, siege warfare, that is economically blocking a city or a country, is considered a war crime. And the only reason that sanctions are not considered a war crime is that they don't occur during a war. Or in other words, it didn't really occur to the people crafting this legislation that somebody would try to blockade an economy unless they were at war with them. But the whole idea that you can direct policies at harming civilians, and we have US policymakers on record saying this, that the reason why they imposed the sanctions on Venezuela were so that the country would face an economic crisis of such a magnitude that people would rebel against Maduro. So I mean, to me, there is a very strong legal case to be made that these actions are actions that violate ethical standards and violate existing international law. Most of the sanctions that we're discussing, with the exception perhaps of those of North Korea, are not taken in the legal United Nations framework, which is the one that's set up for adopting sanctions regimes. So they are, the case of Venezuela, remarkable because the US is the only country that has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela. Europe, Canada, all other Latin American nations, they've said, we're willing to impose personal sanctions, but not economic sanctions, not sanctions that target the oil industry. And this is something in which, and in that case, the Venezuelan case is similar to the case of Iran, where the US hasn't just said, we're going to put these sanctions on persons in the regime. They have actually decided that they're going to target the capacity of the country to generate income, to generate export revenue, and that obviously has an effect on the economy. So saying there are humanitarian exceptions which allow you to purchase food and medicines for humanitarian ends, and calling that a true humanitarian exception, that's really very, very disingenuous. I mean, that's kind of like telling someone that has just lost their job, oh, but don't worry, you can buy anything that you want. I mean, you can go to a store and buy anything. There's just that little small detail that you no longer have a paycheck with which to pay for those items.
Yeah, incredibly important points there. And I think this, this ethos or this thought process that, if we put enough pressure on a country that they'll rebel and that there'll be regime change, underlies a lot of these situations. And unfortunately, I think they're very misplaced. One thing I'll quickly just add here to the conversation is that AFSC worked with Ipsos last year to run a public opinion poll. And we found that actually the majority of Americans were supportive of lifting sanctions if they interfered with humanitarian aid and COVID relief efforts. And I think that's probably the case across the board. So, I think a lot of policymakers, oftentimes I hear sort of, whispered to us in between meetings is that nobody wants to look soft on a country like North Korea. And so they're unwilling to unwind some of these things, even though they know that it's an important concept and that it's, that this is the right thing to do. So one thing that I would just love to underscore to these policymakers is the fact that, the U.S. public is not going to, they're not going to punish them at the polls for this. In fact, they probably reward them. we're getting a little short on time, and we do have 30 more minutes, and we'll open it up to Q&A. But before we get there, I want to open it up to our current panelists to see if there's any other points that they weren't able to get in that they really wanted to discuss. Okay, I'm going to drop, oh, please.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I just wanted to echo what Dr. Rodriguez said in the sense that, and I think, and I wonder, Aisha, Arash, if you sense a similar kind of phenomenon or pattern within your own diaspora communities, right? There's this idea that you can't criticize two things at the same time. And if you, as an American, are criticizing US policy, then ipso facto, you're supporting the other side. That's not what's happening. And there's such a frustration in dealing with that kind of a talking point because it's so disingenuous, as if you cannot be critical of two things at the same time. And the reason why it's problematic is because it's just, it's basic intuition, right? You're as a human being, anybody who's watching or listening, think about any way that you sort of interact and navigate your space in the world. You can find, if you see two people having a discussion or a debate, you can find fault with both. And that's oftentimes what's happening, but because the way that policymakers in the US try to frame these debates is always by politicizing them, right? It's fascinating to me that there's this idea that, we're supporting these populations by targeting them, and therefore they will, stand up against these authoritarian regimes and create regime change, and therefore, these sort of like fantasies that we have yet to actually see happen, but constantly we talk about the potential of them happening. How is it? I'll give you just one example and then we can move on. In the Iranian case right now, we've seen how Iranian authorities have used internet blackouts, right? They shut down the internet so the Iranians cannot communicate. US sanctions exacerbate that problem. There's part of the reason why, or certain amounts of access that Iranians don't have to the internet is because of US sanctions. So when you want to talk about helping or supporting a group of people, maybe helping them getting on the internet and not exacerbating existing problems is a better policy method to go forward, rather than intentionally exacerbating problems because you think that'll sort of foment this fantasy of regime change that, again, I would love to see an example of. I've yet to see this bloodless coup that occurs that brings this whatever policies that we're talking about. Not to mention and we haven't talked about this, and so I'll just mention it briefly, but not to mention the fact that those policies are not applied to everyone. There's complete double standards. If you look at every state that we're representing, right, there are other states that carry out very similar types of crimes or human rights abuses or anything we're talking about where we justify sanctions on these particular targeted countries, and yet those states never get sanctioned. I don't even have to point out which states they are because anybody watching probably knows that. So the fact that not only are we targeting civilians under this like politicized concept that we're actually trying to help them, but that we're not applying the same standard by which we sanction certain countries to countries that are not our adversaries but our friends.
Yeah, excellent points. Yeah, Dr. Jumaan.
I also want to support Assal in what she said. I visited Yemen in September, October of last year. And, the majority of people in Yemen actually feel the US is the main cause of the economic, problems in Yemen and the war. Although in this case in Yemen, the US is supporting the Saudi-led coalition. Yet, if you look at artwork in the cities, if you talk to people, if you do surveys, the majority of people call it the American war and the American sanctions. So, and they do understand. So in Yemen also, unfortunately, in a sense, that it galvanized the population in a nationalistic way, for the group that the US is fighting and the Saudis are fighting.
Yeah, thank you for those points. And, I'll just point out that, especially in the case of North Korea, we often hear when we talk about the issues with sanctions, the idea, the notions of human rights are brought in. And the idea that, we shouldn't undo sanctions because of human rights violations happening in the country. What's really difficult for me to understand about that argument is the fact that these are violating human rights. They are against international law. And how can you argue for civil and political rights while people are starving and facing very severe issues? So it's very difficult. I want to turn, we have a surprise guest actually. And this is quite timely because he's going to give us an overview of what's happening with Cuba. We're joined by Ricardo Herrero, and he's the executive director of the Cuba Study Group. He manages the organization's initiatives and educates policymakers on policies that improve the well-being of the Cuban people, both at home and in the diaspora. Ricardo is a strategic communications and public affairs professional with close to 2 decades of experience working at the intersection of international relations, law, politics, media, and philanthropy. Welcome, Ricardo. We're wondering if you could give us a quick, maybe 3 to 5 minute introduction around what's happening with Cuba.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me today. I've been here off camera, just nodding so hard at everything that I've been hearing, just so many commonalities between all our different cases. We were talking about, Arash started talking about endless wars. And Cuba's sort of the quintessential case of endless sanctions. As many might know, but I'll try to run through the history. Comprehensive trade and an economic embargo was first imposed on Cuba by the United States in the 1960s. At the start of the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, Cuban assets in the United States were frozen, and we blocked all export and imports to and from Cuba. That embargo and all the sanctions that comprised that embargo were repurposed in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in an attempt to try to tighten the screws around the Castro regime to try to finally bring them down. Those sanctions were repurposed under legislation that codified them into law and then conditioned their lifting on a series of all or nothing demands, very unrealistic demands, that would amount to essentially the Cuban government relinquishing power and changing their system all by their own accord. It was a regime change. It was a series of regime change laws, most notably the Helms-Burton Act of 1996. But then we also saw the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, a couple of years before, and then the Trade Sanctions Reform Act of 2000 that imposed a travel ban to Cuba. You fast forward to the Obama years, where through the president's executive authority, we saw opening towards Cuba. Obama reopened embassies that were shut down 50 years prior at the start of the revolution, and then started implementing all sorts of exceptions to the embargo through the licensing authority of the executive that nonetheless have to stay consistent to the spirit of the laws that codified the embargo. And as well as lifting Cuba from the state sponsors of terror list, which they had been added to in the 1980s. Then we go into the seesaw pattern where Trump gets elected in 2016. He starts reversing the Obama opening in 2017, and then really kicks that reversal into high gear in 2019. Under a policy of maximum pressure, which we know was also imposed against Iran, against Venezuela. In the Cuban case, it was ostensibly because of Cuba's support for Venezuela, but it really was also an extension of Trump electoral strategy in South Florida for the year 2020. It was a constant drip of sanctions that were being announced on a weekly basis. A lot of this included shutting down consular services, all sorts of visas being issued out of Havana, most travel to Cuba, and adding Cuba back to the state sponsors of terror list. Furthermore, Trump also tightened sanctions during the COVID pandemic, and in the process shutting down, his administration shut down all formal remittance channels to Cuba. Sanctions during this time have aggravated the multiple crises plaguing this country: economic crisis, humanitarian crisis, political crisis, and have contributed in most recent months to the mass exodus out of Cuba that most recently led to 35,000 Cubans making it to the US-Mexico border in the month of April alone. In the month of March, it was 32,000. We are now on course for the fiscal year of 2022 to exceed the number of Cubans that left the island during the Mariel boat lift of 1980. At that year, it was 125,000. By now, we've probably exceeded that number. We're waiting to see the May numbers. Now, in the last couple of months, however, we have seen the Biden administration start announcing a series of measures, most notably last week, to reverse several Trump-era sanctions imposed on Cuba and start turning the page on this maximum pressure policy. We saw they announced a restoration of full consular services at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. We saw both governments hold high-level direct migration talks, and the United States commit to starting to issue 20,000 immigrant visas that it had originally agreed to start issuing during 1994 migratory accords between the two governments. It also is reinstating the Cuban Family Reunification Program, which was a program implemented during the W. Bush administration to help to allow Cubans here in the United States to claim their family members still living in the country. We're seeing the expansion of authorized travel, commercial and charter flight to provinces beyond Havana. There's another 9 international airports throughout the length of Cuba. You are going to see now travel has been reopened to those provinces after it was shut down by Trump. You're also seeing the authorization of expanded access for Cuban entrepreneurs to cloud technology, payment transfer applications, and other e-commerce platforms. It's going to be very interesting to see with current banking sanctions how these platforms and online tools are actually made accessible to entrepreneurs in Cuba. But it's heartening to know that this has become a priority for the administration. And we're also seeing declared intent to expand access for entrepreneurs to microfinancing and training, as well as lifting all remittance limits imposed by the Trump administration. Obviously, the animating factor here for all these measures has been the migratory crisis that I mentioned earlier. The Biden administration had been largely dragging its feet on reversing much of this policy, even though it had promised to do so during the president's campaign. I would note that the good thing that we can immediately identify in some of these measures taken by the Biden administration is that they are consistent with the Treasury Department's new framework for more closely linking sanctions to policy objectives. We saw this announced back in October of last year after a comprehensive review of all sanctions programs that Treasury announced it wanted to, moving forward, be much more intentional and proactive in linking sanctions and how sanctions are implemented to advance specific policy objectives, to be more strategic, to be more targeted, to reduce collateral damage or in any way or reduce their impact on humanitarian aid. And so here we're seeing it in two instances. We're seeing it in the addressing of the migratory crisis by reopening the consular services and issuing immigrant visas to Cubans, and as well as in tweaking current OFAC regulations to help strengthen the Cuban people and particularly the Cuban private sector by providing them access to microfinancing and those other cloud-based platforms that I mentioned. However, the bad part of all this is that these measures, as they are executive orders, are reversible. These measures are largely license exceptions, general license exceptions to sanctions that have been codified under law. And these laws, as written, do not allow for any sunset clauses, do not allow for any annual reporting requirements of Congress, or for any provisions whatsoever to really mitigate the harmful impact on humanitarian aid and that impact on innocent Cubans on the ground. So ultimately, for us to see a real correction or a real reform in our sanctions policy towards Cuba, as is the case for many other countries, it's going to require legislative action, because otherwise we're going to continue seeing sanctions imposed, removed, imposed again, this constant ping pong from one administration towards the other in efforts to try to cater to domestic interests and voting blocs here in the United States.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that context. It is encouraging to hear that these steps are being taken in Cuba. And of course, we'd like to see them implemented in other contexts as well. As you said, the Treasury Department has committed to some of these things, but we're only seeing it bubble up in certain contexts. So, I'm hoping that that changes. We're running a little bit short on time, so I want to kind of move us into the audience Q&A session. And Ricardo, I'm hoping you can stick around because it would be lovely to get into that conversation in more depth. One of the first questions we got here I thought was really important. Maraf asked, essentially, what are the long-term solutions here? What are the alternatives to sanctions? I'll open it up to panelists if they have thoughts on this.
I mean, I could say, well, I think the biggest problem with sanctions is, as Dr. Rad was mentioning earlier, we have this ongoing conversation about ending endless wars, and I think it's a conversation that's become very diverse and multifaceted, and it's maturing in many ways. The conversation about sanctions is much more primeval. It's basically imposing sanctions strong, removing sanctions weak, and that's it. That's the conversation. Anytime you look and a government even considers lifting sanctions, as counterproductive as they may be, it's perceived as being weak on a authoritarian regime, and we need to move past that. And unfortunately, there is a lack of political will to move beyond that because of the fear of being characterized as being weak on some of these bad actors abroad. So part of it is recognizing that, look, sanctions are a very imperfect tool. We've seen study after study where they show that they work 20% of the time these days. Yet it's become the tool of first resort, the weapon of first resort in U.S. foreign policy making. So we need to just have a much more honest conversation about sanctions, their impact, their efficacy, their impact on innocent populations, the magical thinking behind this idea that by tightening sanctions or imposing blanket sanctions on a population, they're going to want to rise up against their rulers, overthrow them, and democracy will rise from the ashes like a phoenix from the flame. We need to really just disabuse people of that idea because, as Dr. Rad mentioned earlier, we've yet to see a case of it actually happening. And then talking about how can we reform our sanctions programs to be much more targeted, much more strategic, and mitigate all the collateral damage and negative impacts of these sanctions. But it has to lead to ultimately to legislation, because that's the only way that you can sort of set some real guardrails around this.
I actually, thank you, Ricardo. I have a few points on that. One, who appointed the US, the policemen of the world, where it decides who's sanctioned, who's not sanctioned. There are many authoritarian regimes that are friends of the US government that are never sanctioned, no matter how many abuses of human rights they conduct. And I'll just name one, Saudi Arabia, because it's leading a war on the Yemeni people. So why should the US be the one determining that? That's one thing. The other one, I will go back to what Dr. Rodriguez said, is that sanctions in the absence of war and blockades and sieges are actually against international law. So, and I hope, Dr. Rodriguez, that you can say something to that effect.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that, first of all, we have to understand that there are problems that the international community wants to solve, which aren't necessarily easy to solve. And that does not mean that they imply a justification for targeting civilians. I mean, that's like, if I mean, one can think of many examples or analogies in which, if you have somebody who's carrying out kind of criminal activity, well, does that give the state the right to kidnap their family and threaten their family so that the criminal will give up? And the reality is that that is a violation, that's a heinous violation of the human rights of people who, in this example, would be the criminal's families. Well, same thing happens here. And why should you be targeting innocent Venezuelans, and particularly with sanctions that end up having the strongest effect on the most vulnerable groups, or innocent Iranians or Afghans or Yemenis, because of what their governments are doing? This is just not a tool that should be under consideration, that period. Now, the international community has to deal with these governments with the tools that are at its disposal. And those tools involve diplomatic pressure. I believe that those tools should involve adequately targeted personal sanctions, which are different from economic sanctions, as long as those sanctions are designed so as to protect civilians from their collateral effects. Because what we've seen is that even the use of personal sanctions can generate, through overcompliance and by toxifying the relations with an economy, it can generate significant consequences on the economy and on civilians. But I do think that there's a legitimate use for some types of sanctions, as long as you are taking steps to ensure that they do not produce a significant collateral effects on civilians or on the most vulnerable groups. Now, I also think that there are several of these cases in which there is a much more sensible approach. Now, there's no one size fits all. So negotiation and dialogue between the parts to the political conflict, I think, is the solution in Venezuela. It may not be the solution in North Korea, because among other things, the type of problems that you're dealing with in North Korea are different, and they really have to do with nuclear non-proliferation, a decision by the international community that's going to limit access to nuclear weapons. So that I think is a completely different problem than that of a country that was democratic, where there was significant democratic backsliding and those democratic institutions deteriorated, and the international community wants to do something about it. Can the international community do something about it, and should it do something about it? Yes, I think, but within the acceptable means of diplomatic pressure and the type of pressure that does not affect civilians. But also, I think that if you take a closer look at what's happening in Venezuela, what you see is a deep and protracted confrontation between two political groups that are aiming to take control of the state, and which, when they have had control of the state, both of them have acted with complete disregard for the well-being of civilians. And that's how you can see, you can identify that in some of the actions of the opposition when it briefly was able to grab power through a 2002 coup. But you can also see that in some of the actions of the current opposition leadership. So what I believe that the international community has to do is, number one, try to support a framework where these two sides can negotiate a coexistence agreement and can negotiate even rules of engagement for their own political conflict that do not severely affect Venezuelans and vulnerable Venezuelans, but also support a framework in which other groups that are representative of Venezuelans and that do not feel represented by these political actors can be involved. So I think that if you had broader negotiations in Venezuela, the US has supported this idea that negotiations are only between Maduro and Guaido. And it turns out that 80% of Venezuelans don't feel represented by Maduro and Guaido. Even in recent regional elections, the Guaido's parties, the parties that back Guaido, received only 40% of the votes cast against the government. So 60% of non-government votes went to other opposition parties, which the US insists are not relevant political actors. There's civil society, there's the church, there's the business sector, there are human rights organizations, there are humanitarian organizations. So if you broaden the space for a dialogue that's truly representative of society, I think that you're going to get more stable agreements, and you're going to get the basis for this country to actually frame a coexistence arrangement, which is what's necessary for it to get out of this economically destructive political conflict that it's trapped in.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm hearing, oh, yeah, Dr. Rod, do you want to get in really quick?
I was just going to add, I think one of the sort of like threads that you can draw from what everyone is saying is, look, if sanctions are meant to be a tool of accountability, right? That's how they are. That's how we discuss them. They're meant to target bad actors, because what does it even mean to be a bad actor? They're breaking with international law. They're committing human rights abuses. I said earlier, the fact that there, and Aisha also commented, this is not actually being applied consistently. And what that really makes us think about, what do we do? And if this is the problem, the original question was like, what do we do then as an alternative? I think first of all, it's having these conversations, right? And Ricardo pointed to this. It's like, well, no one really even talks about this that much, because it's not as sort of obvious an issue as a war is. But it has, we talked about the fact that it has consequences for the US, it has consequences for the civilian population, and in fact, they're not really effective. So think about that. Think about any policy that you have that hurts civilians, don't work, and hurt domestically the country that you're in. It's insane that we continue to have those policies, but it's because we're not having real conversations of what the reality of that policy is. It is a tool of US empire. That's just what it is. And you have to be able to talk about it in an honest fashion if we are going to move forward in talking about it in any other way. If it was a tool of accountability, right now you have Russia sanctions, the #1 sanctioned country in the world because of its illegal invasion of Ukraine, no doubt. Was there an equivalent reaction to when the US invaded Iraq? No, because the US can't be sanctioned in the same way. The fact that it's a unilateral tool that can be used in this manner makes it an imbalanced tool. So if we want to think about, well, what is the solution? We have to look at those international institutions that are deeply flawed and don't work because the most powerful countries don't allow them to work. And that speaks to what Dr. Rodriguez was saying as well. We have to look at approaches that actually use diplomatic means to solve an issue. And if I'm talking about the Iranian side, if that's my, sort of the country that I'm discussing in this particular situation, we did that, right? We know that it works. We used diplomacy as a tool, diplomatic solution with the JCPOA to resolve an issue that the global community thought was important, such as non-proliferation. Iran abided by that agreement. And who was the party that withdrew? Who was the party that quit? Who was the party that violated by reimposing sanctions? The US. And so we have to be able, especially as Americans, when we're having these conversations in the United States, to hold our own officials accountable when they are not using those tools correctly, when they're using those tools in a way that are to the detriment of civilian populations, that are to the detriment of the American population, and that are ineffective.
Wonderfully said, and I'm glad you jumped in, because I think that intervention actually asked our next question, which is, why do sanctions continue to be used if they are so ineffective? And I just want to quickly sort of emphasize a couple of points there, which is, it sounds like what we're saying is there one needs to be a change in mindset. This understanding that sanctions are somehow strength and that somehow hurting the most vulnerable is a show of strength is obviously flawed. And I always point to the word authority, comes from auctoritas. And auctoritas in Latin meant to influence through character. And if we really want to influence and change people's behavior, we have to start modeling that behavior ourselves. And I really want to agree with Dr. Rodriguez in terms of sort of redefining what we mean by diplomacy. And actually in North Korea, the solution, at least in my mind, really is dialogue, right? It is redefining diplomacy, because when you talk about conducting diplomacy with the State Department, their version of that is getting other countries to comply with US unilateral sanctions. That to me is not diplomacy, that's coercion. And just a final point on this, AFSC and the National Committee on American Foreign Policy undertook an exhaustive research study on US-China official dialogue processes. The conversation in Washington right now is that US-China dialogue failed, mainly because China didn't change its behavior. But in fact, we went back and we looked at over 1,000 commitments that the two countries made to each other. And actually, China followed through more often than the United States. And it was critical to things like climate change mitigation, stabilizing the global economy after the 2008 financial crisis, and as well as handling global pandemics. And all of that was dismantled prior to COVID-19 pandemic. So in a way, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot, and we're putting real tools that we have away under this rubric of showing strength. I'll stop there, and I want to end with this final question here, which I think is really important. Somebody asked, in the face of sanctions, and I'm going to rephrase this slightly, what can the individuals in sanctioned countries do about this? It's perhaps a difficult question to answer, but
I could try to answer this question. It's a very difficult question. On the Cuba context, I can tell you we've seen this happen now over the course of the last couple of years, where the conditions on the ground have gotten so desperate, in large part because of the mismanagement of the Cuban government, that many on the ground, even though they know that sanctions aggravate hardships on the ground, exacerbate the conditions on the ground, they don't even want to talk about sanctions because they're so fed up with their own government. And so since the government is always blaming everything on US sanctions, they use it as the ultimate scapegoat for all their failings. You see the response that they're having is basically saying, well, if the government's always talking about sanctions, I'm not going to talk about sanctions. I'm just going to talk about the government, because they're the direct cause of most of my misfortunes. I think the only word of advice I would have for those folks, it's keep the conversation ample. If both things are adding to hardships on the ground, recognize both. You're not doing anybody any favors by ignoring one and only focusing on the other. Both of them are exacerbating negative conditions on the ground. Both of them are compounding hardships for innocent civilians on the ground. They both need to be recognized as such.
Thank you for that. And just quickly to wrap us up, I was curious, Dr. Jumaan, were you trying to make a quick point as well?
Yeah, I think at least with the Yemeni people, they've been, doing a lot of videos to show the impact. And I think it's our job, especially those who are in the US and yes, is to let the American public understand the impact of sanctions. Because a lot of people don't understand the impact of sanctions. And as I said, the silent killers. So as we educate everybody of the impact, hopefully that will translate into reaching out to our representatives and our congressional people to say, this cannot happen.
Yeah, lifting up their voices is so important. Dr. Rodriguez, we'll give you the final word here.
Yeah, no, I'd like to point out that I think it's really important to focus on the policy debate in the countries that are imposing these sanctions, because in the end, it is the governments of these countries, and particularly the government of the United States, that's doing it. And one of the things that's happened particularly in the cases of Cuba and Venezuela, is that the groups that are most mobilized in order to try to affect these policies are actually diaspora groups that are very hardline opposition and want to maintain and even toughen sanctions. These groups are not necessarily representative even of how all migrants think, even of how all Venezuelan or Cuban migrants in the US think, but they're very organized. They're also located in a pivotal state, which is Florida, and they know how to use that capacity of mobilization to affect US politics. So that's why I do think that it makes sense to bring this debate into the US policy arena. And when I've seen US legislators, for example, the 18 legislators that recently sent a letter to President Biden, or when I've seen representatives, for example, ask direct questions of US government officials about the impact of sanctions, I think that plays a key role. If you look at the case of Iraq sanctions, for example, Iraq sanctions were having a significant adverse effect on the humanitarian situation and were leading to large increases in infant mortality. And it was only when Secretary Albright was actually grilled about this on a 60 Minutes program that the US began rethinking. It was such a deep embarrassment to her that she didn't know how to answer the question of, well, sanctions have led to 50,000 deaths of children in Iraq. Is that worth it? That forced the US government to completely rethink sanctions. And there they introduced the Iraqi oil for food program, which despite all of its shortcomings, had a significantly positive effect on the capacity of the country to generate the oil revenue that it needed in order to deal with its humanitarian situation. And there's strong evidence that humanitarian conditions in Iraq improved significantly as a result of that program. But it has to come from debate in the countries that are setting the policies. And it has to come from having an answer. If the only voice that's speaking is the voice of the hardline diaspora groups that are saying, well, these are evil people and sanctions should be imposed on them. Well, if that's the only thing that people hear, then obviously that's going to affect policy debate. If we can tell the other side of the story, then I think that we can have a more balanced policy discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great point to leave it on. As you can see, there's a lot more to discuss. Maybe we should have a part 2, part 3, maybe all the way to part 10, because I think our agenda is like bursting at the seams and there's a lot of synergy here. I just really quickly want to thank everybody who tuned in for our conversation today, NIAC and all of our panelists for all their contributions. This is a wonderful conversation. And I think we'll have to continue it on from here because there's much more to discuss. Thank you to everybody. And we'll see you hopefully at the next conversation.